I'm talking about slavery. Slavery, sex slavery, mainstream slavery, slavery and sex slavery, slavery and sex slavery, slavery, sex slavery as sex slaves. Slavery, slavery, pro-slavery, slavery. I'm not pro-slavery. I don't care about slavery. Bring back slavery. You made a point about slavery. You like... Let's imagine I and my soldiers raid your village, kill you and your male members, and then take your daughters, wives, even mothers as sex slaves. Your women would not just have to deal with the fact that their husbands and sons and fathers have been murdered, but also, the same night, they have to deal with having sex with the killers of their fathers and sons and husbands and brothers. Would you be okay with that, Haqiqatjou? Now, can you answer that one? Maybe you can't feel that for other women who are not related to you, but surely, even as a sadist like yourself, could feel that for your female family members. If not, then I can only hope that other men who supposedly follow you don't think like you. Some Muslims...
Why do people who bring up this concubine argument always emphasize the plight of the women? The men have been killed in this hypothetical. Are we not going to shed any tears for all the men who have died? You're just concerned about the women who are going to be enslaved, but what about the guys that died? Someone in the comments I just see saying, "Oh, I find so much of this extremely disturbing." Like, this, do you find war disturbing? Like when you read about all of the battles of history, all of the wars of history, even according to like American history, when they're teaching American history is very bloody. Even by their own, like, these are the winners, America, that's telling its story, like standard in grade school. You had the founding forefathers, these very noble, enlightened men who wanted freedom from the tyranny of King George III. And they, there's the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and this and this. It's like war after war after war. Basically 90%, I think it's literally like very close to 90% or more of America's history has been America engaged in war. But even according to like the national consciousness, this kind of patriotic consciousness, war is good. War is in the sense that it's necessary. It's something that you have to engage in for right and truth and justice and freedom and equality to rise to the top. Right? For the good guys to win. Isn't this the premise of every single Marvel movie? Every single Marvel movie or every single superhero movie or literally every single war movie, it's all glorifying war and violence. But that's just seen as normal. But that involves killing and death and brutality and shedding of blood. Bombing people, especially modern warfare, it's extremely, extremely bloody and violent. But you don't bat an eyelash at that. You don't bat an eyelash at any of that, and even though it's very horrifying. So just reflect on that when you think about these heroes, whether they're fictional or actual historical figures. They're engaged in killing and murder, killing and violence, but it's seen as justified. It's seen as taking someone's life is justified. So if that's one level, then what about other things that might be justified as well? Other actions that are actually less violent than killing. Less violent than killing, which includes, having a concubine, having sexual relations, as a necessary aspect of war. And this is what I argue in the next 30 minutes or so. But just logically, if you think about that and compare, what is so special about sex and that kind of relationship? Like, Muslims aren't Victorian Christians. We don't have that same kind of view of sexual relations as being inherently dirty. We don't have that view. We are created by God. Allah has created human beings with certain capacities, and one of those capacities is to have sexual relations, and part of it is for reproduction, and part of it is actually for pleasure. There's nothing shameful about it when it's done in the permissible ways. And there are certain ways that's permissible and certain ways that's impermissible. One of the ways that's permissible is with milk yamin, those that your right hands possess. The concubines. And there's nothing shameful about that. There's nothing shameful about that for the reasons that I outline. For the reasons that I explained. This is something that's necessary. It's something that leads to a lot of good outcomes. And if you, like, your mind is just like, oh my God, it goes against freedom and equality and all of these liberal principles, or it's just like, it's not something that you're familiar with and it's foreign and therefore you have this kind of reaction. Okay, well, there are a lot of things that you might not be familiar with that other people, 99% of people, had no problem with. Just like you have no problem with slaughtering in war. You have no problem with that. In fact, you glorify it. You watch movies about it. You read books about it. You have songs singing about it. You're just familiar with that, and you're not familiar with another aspect of war and conquest and these things that existed for 99% of human history. Yeah, logically. And then sex, right? Sex. These liberals are so like, sex is worse. This is the implication of what Harris is saying. And he actually explicitly says this later, like, being a slave is worse than being killed. That makes no sense according to utilitarianism, according to maximizing pleasure. Because if you're still alive, then you still have a possibility of gaining more pleasure. Your overall utility still has a chance of going up as opposed to dying, especially dying painfully, like through nuclear warfare or through bombs or chemical warfare. So even according to utilitarianism, you should prefer to be a slave as opposed to just being wiped out, let alone your entire people be wiped out. So it's logically incoherent from that aspect, but from another aspect, being a sex slave, on the liberal mindset, they often criticize Muslims and say, oh, Muslims are so, or Christians as well, Christians and Muslims, you're so prudish, you're just a bunch of prudes. You have to be free, just have sex and enjoy life and don't worry about getting married. You can just sleep with anyone. It's just a beautiful, sex is just like any other bodily function. Why do you have all this taboo around sex? Just, be a hippie. Smoke some weed and, hook up. Drink a beer, hook up, just enjoy life. Sex is just another bodily function, like eating food. Like eating a hamburger. Eating a taco. Smoke some weed, eat the taco, have sex. It's all just life, man. This is the liberal mindset. So if sex is just like eating a hamburger, according to you liberal, free-thinking, woke people, then sex slavery just means like forcing someone to eat a hamburger. So tell me, like, what's so significant? You're forcing someone to eat a hamburger or to eat a taco. So, like, there's so many contradictions with your philosophy, your liberal philosophy.
Okay, so I'm going to address slavery and sex slavery, but let me just be explicit for the audience, since Harris doesn't seem to be getting it. I'm arguing that Sharia law is superior to human rights because Sharia rule preserves marriage and family. Okay? And human rights doesn't. It destroys marriage and family and community and the human race. That's the argument. So let's move on to slavery. The reality is, to win a war in the pre-modern period, it was all about manpower. The main factor in whether your people would live or die was numbers. So this meant that if you won a battle, you couldn't just let the captives go because they would just regroup and attack you again or join your enemies. So you only had two options. You either had to kill or enslave. Neither option is good, right? But that's just the nature of war. You always have to use violence against the other side. You either kill or enslave. So Harris, you want to criticize Islam and call Islam barbaric for having slavery, but imagine if I asked you this question. question. Do you support using weapons in war? Do you support using guns to shoot people or swords to stab people and kill people? Do you support that? Because all of that is violent. All of that is barbaric. Presumably, you'd say, yeah, of course I support weapons and killing, because how else are you going to fight war and defend yourself? Well, that's exactly the point with slavery. In the pre-modern period, you couldn't have war without slavery any more than you could have war without weapons and killing. In other words, if killing people can sometimes be justified, then slavery can also sometimes be justified. And this is exactly what your friend, apostate prophet, accepted with open arms in our debate last year. Imagine in the future they invent a new technology for war where a laser shoots from space and can directly target any person in the world. And the technology is so precise that there are zero casualties other than the intended target. Then people in this future might look back at our time and say, look how barbaric those people in the 21st century were. Look how barbaric with their tanks and guns and bombs. Would that make any sense? That's exactly what you're doing by criticizing Islam for slavery. You should just acknowledge that slavery could be completely justified in certain circumstances, which, by the way, are the circumstances people have lived in for 99% of human history. Now, if you want to argue that Islam requires enslaving people today, I would say that that is not correct. It depends on the imam. If you read fiqh, Islam...
So before we get into the modern period, I just don't understand how anyone can dispute this. Like, it's even like I'm using a purely utilitarian argument. It's a purely utilitarian argument. It can also be an evolutionary argument. It could also be like a cultural evolution argument, that if you believe in evolution and cultural evolution and evolutionary psychology, presumably Harris believes, well, actually he called it all riffraff. All of the academic references are just riffraff. But for those who are atheists or they're not religious, presumably they accept a utilitarian argument, an evolutionary psychology argument. Cultures are going to engage in behaviors that are adaptive, and what's most adaptive, what's going to be the kind of behavior that leads to the most good, or the most utility, or allows that community to survive over other communities, then those behaviors will propagate, and then you have this kind of cultural evolution explanation for why certain behaviors come into human nature over time, or human cultures over time. And taking slaves is one of those behaviors, is one of those things that, according to evolutionary psychology, conflict itself is inherent to human nature. I mentioned Jonathan Haidt, like having this kind of in-group versus out-group mentality. All human beings have it. And sometimes it can be a source of destruction or evil, and sometimes it's wholesome and necessary. And, you know, it depends on the situation. But, like, for example, racial in-group, like thinking that you're better you're better than someone because of the color of your skin or where you were born, that's evil, right? But having a loyalty to those who share your beliefs, having loyalty especially to those who believe in God, who believe in truth, who follow the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is al-wala wal-bara. Al-wala means loyalty to the Muslims, to the loyalty to Allah, loyalty to His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, loyalty to the Ummah, to the believers. This is important. It's valuable. It's praised. It's a sign of iman, of having true belief, and it's also something that's inbuilt. Okay, this kind of instinct. And bara, disassociation, and like we don't prefer, or we're not going to prefer those who disbelieve in Allah, disbelieve in His Messenger, or even worse, they fight against Allah, fight against His Messenger, defame Islam. We're not going to have a kind of affinity for those people, or we're not going to prioritize those people and put them as our role models or our spiritual role models or people above us in terms of being our, awliya or our wali, in terms of walaya. So we're not going to do that. That's what bara means in a nutshell. But this is also something that is found within human nature. In-group, out-group. Yeah, so even on a utilitarian basis, slavery is justified because the consequences of not taking slaves is going to lead to less utility, less pleasure for more amount of people. That's the utilitarian argument. and I laid it out, but Harris can't acknowledge that. None of these atheists can. Actually, Apus acknowledged it. Apus, to his credit, he had to own the fact that on a utilitarian argument, slavery is actually justified historically. So in the past. But then what about present day, where we have all this technology? Then slavery is not justified, right? And so that's the argument that I addressed next.
Islamic jurisprudence, this is very clear. There's no requirement that people captured in war are enslaved. This is discussed in classical fiqh books. For example, Bidayat al-Mujtahid by Ibn Rushd in the 12th century. Go to Kitab al-Jihad, and he summarizes the position of the four Sunni schools of fiqh. The Imam has the option to pardon people and forego taking slaves in war. The Imam does not have the option to suspend, for example, hudud punishments for lashing for fornicators. But taking slaves is one of those issues where the Imam can forego if it's in the best interest of the Muslim community. So in modern times, a hypothetical Imam could exercise this option and still be 100% consistent with the most strict understanding of traditional Islamic law. Now, Harris, since you seem to be ignorant about these details about...
So I'm trying to make the distinction between hudud. So had, to apply the had, the Imam doesn't have the prerogative to suspend the hudud and say that, okay, we're no longer going to lash the fornicator. We're no longer going to, cut the hand of the thief. We're no longer going to have these punishments. We're no longer going to collect zakat. We're no longer going to establish salah. These different aspects of the Sharia that he doesn't have the prerogative to suspend those things. But when it comes to taking slaves, when it comes to, for example, certain siyasi decisions in siyasa, meaning politics, like, for example, who to have treaties with. Like, are you going to make a treaty with this country or that country, or go to war with them? The Imam has the decision. Like, he can make the decision to attack a country, to not attack a country. Those are decisions that the Imam can make. He can decide to do so or to not do so, depending on different considerations that he has. So this is an important distinction to make between siyasa versus hudud. And overall, Sharia is so much more than just criminal punishments and corporal punishments. But these murtaddeen and these atheists, these liberals, this is all they want to talk about. This is all they want to focus on. They're giving this message to the world that Islam is just about slavery and sex slavery and wife beating, and this is all that Islam is about. This is why, this is another big reason that they're con men, because they're distracting people from all of the benefits of Islam, all of the beauty of Islam, and all of the things that Islam offers that are actually direct solutions to the evils of the modern world. All of the problems and the dysfunction and decay of the modern world are addressed so beautifully in Islam, because Islam is from the Creator. Islam is genius, brilliance from the Creator for the benefit of all of humanity. So you can't have a straight up argument. You can't have a straight up debate about that. You have to constantly derail into slavery, sex slavery, wife beating, because that's all you have is like this shock value type of gotcha type of argument where you confuse people and you distract them from these clear positives. So I don't think it's actually effective in debate to try to gloss over slavery, to gloss over wife beating, to gloss over hudud. Or jihad, like jihad al-talab. Don't gloss over those, but you have to have good responses. If you gloss over it, the non-Muslim thinks, okay, this is just another apologetic, excuse-making, cucking, which we'll talk about in a second. This is just, you're embarrassed by this aspect of your religion, so you're trying to circumvent it and avoid the topic. It's very clear. Like, people can sense that. And they're not going to take you seriously. It sounds like you're hiding something from them. You're not showing the real truth. Islam is just like every other false religion. And we don't want to be religious. We want to be free-thinking, liberal individualists. So this is why it's necessary, like I prepared with him, I prepared with Apos to talk about these topics. And I teach about these topics as well in Al-Asna Institute and elsewhere. Because you need to address it. Like, why? If Islam is so moral and it's truly the religion of God, the Creator, how could it have something as immoral as slavery? How can this be a prophet of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad, when he has slaves himself? He eventually freed, but he had those slaves at one point. He had the concubine at some point. So isn't that, how can he be a prophet? How can he be the peak of morality? This is the shubha, this is the doubt that lingers in the mind of not only non-Muslims, but also Muslims, some Muslims. And you have to address it in a very clear, rational way, using argumentation that appeals to people's understanding and their level of understanding of morality, which nowadays is a utilitarian kind of morality that you can make that. You can make a historical argument, you can make a psychological argument, you can make a utilitarian argument. And then they'll have a hard time disputing that or refuting that. And for many, it makes sense. Like, inshallah, it makes sense for people. And then they get over it. They realize that Islam is a religion for every aspect of life, not just when you're sitting comfortably with your family, but sometimes life involves war. That's human nature. That's the way that God has created. Allah has created us as human beings in this dunya, on this earth. Sometimes there's war. Sometimes there's conflict. Sometimes there are battles. Sometimes there are crimes. Sometimes there's theft. Sometimes there's depression. Sometimes there's famine. Islam, the beauty of Islam, the genius of Islam is that it gives us guidance for all of these dimensions of life, the good and the bad, the easy and the difficult. This is the beauty of Islam. Other religions, they don't have this. They literally do not have this. So you have to appreciate Islam and recognize its divine origin, its divine nature. Guys, if you're interested in this type of analysis and you want to know how to break down the modern ideologies of the day, we offer courses that will train you to think like a strong Muslim, how to respond to these kinds of attacks on Islam and the Islamic way of life. If you're interested in this, join Al-Asna Institute today.